My name is Isabella Carter. 10 years ago, my family buried an empty coffin with my name on it. Tonight, I paid for their champagne, and they don't even know I'm here. The crystal ballroom of the Rosewood Hotel shimmered like a crown jewel under a crisp Boston evening sky in April 2025. Chandeliers spilled golden light across polished marble floors, catching the edges of gold-trimmed blush-pink florals that cascaded from every corner. Crystal stemware gleamed on white-draped tables, reflecting the two perfect smiles of the city's elite, an ostentatious display of wealth so excessive it could only belong to the old money families who'd ruled this town for generations. Families like the Carters, who wore their privilege like armor and buried their failures without a flicker of remorse. I stood just inside the entrance, cloaked in shadow, my gold and black Venetian mask pressed cool against my skin. The air smelled of champagne and roses, a cloying mix that churned my stomach. Below me, the masquerade unfolded like a play I'd memorized every line of, but never wanted to star in. My sister, Sophia Carter, glided through the crowd in her couture gown, a vision of ivory silk and delicate lace, her laughter bright and rehearsed as she soaked in praise like a flower basking in sunlight. Our parents, Charles and Evelyn Carter, trailed her like royal attendants, their postures rigid with pride, their faces glowing with a joy I'd never once felt directed at me. Not when I graduated top of my business class at Harvard, not when I dared to challenge their crumbling shipping dynasty, not even when I begged them to hear me out before they erased me from their lives. "Just sign here, Miss Moreau," the wedding coordinator whispered beside me, her voice hushed with deference as she extended a sleek tablet, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. I took it without hesitation, suppressing the cruel smile tugging at the corners of my lips. If only they knew. 3 years ago, I'd bought the entire Rosewood Hotel chain under the name Isabella Moreau, a persona I'd sculpted with a faint European lilt, a cultivated air of mystique, and a past so carefully obscured no one could trace it back to the Carter family crypt. This very hotel had hosted their fundraisers, their charity galas, and now my sister's wedding, a $300,000 affair they'd financed on credit, oblivious to the fact that I held the deed. My signature slid across the screen in a practiced flourish, a name they'd never connect to the daughter they'd declared dead a decade ago. Elena Carter, I thought bitterly, the name echoing in my mind like a ghost's whisper. This is what your death bought you. The masquerade theme had been Sophia's idea, naturally. She'd always loved theatrics, probably thought the masks were romantic, a nod to some fairy tale fantasy where love conquered all. For me, they were a shield. Behind my gold and black Venetian design, I was invisible, the ghost of Isabella Carter, sipping champagne at the back of their ballroom, more powerful than any of them could fathom. My velvet gown brushed the floor as I shifted, the fabric soft against my skin, a stark contrast to the hard edges of the empire I'd built. The ceremony was lovely, I murmured to the coordinator, my voice wrapped in the lilt of an accent I'd borrowed from nowhere, part French, part fiction, all armor. She beamed, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm. "Thank you, Miss Moreau. It's such an honor to have you here personally. The Carters are one of Boston's most prominent families, you know." Oh, I knew. I knew the legacy they'd forged on shipping routes and social climbing, the lineage they polished like silver to keep it gleaming in the eyes of their peers. I knew the aristocratic lies they told to maintain their throne, how my father's empire rested on cargo ships and contracts, how my mother's rested on perception and prestige. Together, they'd constructed a world that couldn't tolerate imperfection, a world where I dared to say no. They didn't bury me because I failed. They buried me because I chose freedom. And now I was back, paying for their champagne, owning the marble beneath their polished shoes, watching the House of Carter dance at a wedding funded by the daughter they'd turned into a ghost. 10 years ago, I was Isabella Carter, eldest daughter of Boston's shipping elite, raised to uphold a legacy I never asked for. At 22, fresh from Harvard Business School with honors and ambition burning in my veins, I walked into my father's oak-paneled office with a vision. Carter Shipping was a fossil, aging fleets, outdated routes, competitors like Blake Enterprises racing ahead with drones and digital logistics. I'd spent months crafting a plan: modernize the ships, digitize the supply chain, outpace the future. I stood there, slides in hand, heart pounding, ready to prove I could lead. "Marry Nathaniel Blake." My father barked instead, cutting me off mid-sentence, his voice a gavel slamming down. "Merge our companies with his family's. That's your future." Nathaniel Blake, arrogant, twice my age, with a smile that promised control and eyes that stripped me bare, was the heir to a rival shipping dynasty. I'd met him once at a gala, when his hand lingered too long on my arm and he whispered, "You'll do nicely," like I was a horse he'd bet on. I said no. Not because I didn't understand the stakes. Nathaniel's family could have saved Carter Shipping from its slow bleed, but because I believed merit should trump bloodlines and dinner party deals. Naive, maybe, but I'd earned that belief. The argument that followed still haunts me. My father's face purple with rage, shouting about disgrace and loyalty, his fist slamming the desk so hard a crystal decanter rattled. My mother's voice like ice cracking on a frozen lake, calling me selfish, embarrassing, a stain on the Carter name. Then the ultimatum: marry Nathaniel or be disowned. "You'll regret this," my father growled as I turned to leave. "You're nothing without us." I walked out the next morning with a duffel bag and $50,000 from a trust fund they'd forgotten to freeze, my first mini-win. It wasn't much, but it was enough to disappear. I checked into a dingy motel on the edge of town, the kind with flickering neon signs and cigarette burns on the carpet, and cried for 2 days straight. I'd lost my family, my home, my identity, everything I'd been raised to be. But on day 3, I stopped. I cut my hair short with a pair of rusty scissors, dyed it dark with a $5 box from a drugstore, traded my polished Carter accent for something rougher, untraceable. I wasn't Isabella Carter anymore. I was a blank slate, and that was freedom. The next 6 months were a brutal grind. I rented a studio apartment in Providence, no bigger than my mother's walk-in closet, with peeling paint and a radiator that clanked all night. I worked odd jobs, waitressing at a greasy diner, typing data entry until my fingers ached, anything to keep the lights on. At night, I taught myself venture capital, digital logistics, supply chain disruption. I devoured books from the public library, watched grainy YouTube tutorials, haunted coffee shops with free Wi-Fi until I could speak the language of power. Then came my second win. A small shipping company in Rhode Island was going under. 5 rusting cargo ships, a handful of local routes, and an owner desperate to unload his debts. I scraped together $40,000 of my trust fund, walked into his cluttered office in a thrift store blazer, and negotiated hard. He laughed when I made my offer, a 22-year-old with no name and no backup. "Good luck, kid," he said, shaking his head as he signed the papers. I didn't need luck. I had a plan. I sold 2 ships for scrap, netting $15,000, and used the cash to retrofit the other 3 with basic GPS tracking I'd coded myself on a second-hand laptop. I studied Carter Shipping's client list, public records they'd never bothered to hide, and found a textile factory they'd rejected for being too small. I pitched them modernized routes, showing how I could cut their shipping time by 20% with my lean operation. They signed on my first contract. Within 3 months, Vanguard Logistics turned a profit, $12,000. Small but real. I wasn't just surviving, I was building. Every dollar was a quiet jab at the family who'd buried me, proof I could play their game better than they ever did. 6 months after I vanished, I worked up the nerve to email Sophia. One line: "Are you okay?" I didn't expect forgiveness, just a thread to the sister I'd loved, the little girl who'd once braided my hair and giggled over secrets under the covers. The message bounced back. I assumed she'd changed her email until I found her on Instagram, draped in black, standing between my parents at my funeral. "Tragic sailing accident." The captions read, "Isabella Carter, lost too soon." Photos showed Sophia, 12 years old, eyes red but smiling faintly beside an empty coffin, a single white rose in her hand. I don't even like boats. They'd staged my death. held a memorial at the Rosewood, my mother dabbing her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, my father delivering a eulogy about his beloved daughter, while I scraped rent money together in a roach-infested apartment. Sophia, old enough to know better, played along, her silence louder than any scream. That was the day Isabella Carter truly died. And Isabella Moreau was born. My third win came a year later. I'd saved enough to move to New York, where the Carters were just a whisper among the city's chaos. I reinvented myself. A faint European accent, practiced in front of a cracked bathroom mirror until it felt natural, a wardrobe of sharp suits bought secondhand and tailored to fit, a backstory vague enough to intrigue but solid enough to trust. I'd tracked Carter Shipping's financials. Public filings showed they were bleeding cash, losing clients to competitors like Blake Enterprises. I used that intel to target their overlooked markets, building Vanguard's reputation as a nimble alternative. I landed a meeting with a venture capitalist in a sleek Manhattan office, pitching Vanguard as a lean, tech-driven disruptor. My hand shook as I laid out my numbers. Revenue up 50% in 6 months. 3 new clients poached from Carter's discard pile, but my voice stayed steady. "They're stuck in the past," I said, sliding a chart across the table. "I'm the future." "You've got guts," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm in $500,000 for 10%. With that cash, I upgraded my fleet with automated tracking, hired a coder named Jasmine to build proprietary routing software, and doubled down on Carter's smaller clients, ones my father had ignored, deeming them beneath the family name. Every contract was a brick in my new empire, every handshake a silent checkmate to the parents who'd buried me. By year 5, Vanguard was a name in the industry, small but fierce, a shadow creeping up on the giants. I'd bought out 2 more failing companies, modernized their assets with tech my father couldn't comprehend, and turned their losses into my gains. But my real chess game began with Carter Shipping's own pieces. It started with a warehouse in Singapore. A crumbling relic Carter had offloaded in a cash crunch, listed quietly on an international exchange. I snapped it up through a shell company for $200,000, using profits from Vanguard's early contracts. Next, I found an abandoned shipping route to Jakarta they'd let lapse, too minor for their grand vision. I revived it with 2 refurbished freighters, undercutting their rates by 15%, and landed a deal with a textile exporter Carter had snubbed. Then came a logistics contract in Boston, a mid-sized retailer my father had rejected for lacking prestige. I offered them real-time tracking and a 10% discount, and they signed within a week. Step by step, I turned their discards into my foundation. Then came the Rosewood hotel chain. My parents had hosted their galas there for decades, a glittering symbol of their status. When it hit the market in 2022, over-leveraged, mismanaged, drowning in $50 million of debt, I saw my chance. I'd spent years studying their finances, knew their creditors were circling. I started small, bought a $1 million lien on one of their properties through a proxy in Hong Kong, then leveraged it to negotiate with the bank. They were desperate to unload the chain before it tanked completely. I played my moves carefully. Months of haggling through shell companies, a Singapore-based lawyer who asked no questions, and a final bid of $30 million, funded by Vanguard's profits and a silent loan from my venture capitalist. The sellers fought, but I knew their weak spots. Every missed payment, every panicked board meeting leaked through industry whispers. The day I signed the papers, I stood alone in the crystal ballroom, staring at the chandeliers my family adored, the marble they'd danced on. It was mine now, my 4th win. I didn't celebrate with champagne or a party. I sat in the empty room, tracing the gold compass at my throat. My grandmother's, the only Carter who'd ever seen me as more than a pawn and planned. Owning the Rosewood wasn't just about power. It was about turning their own board against them, a checkmate they'd never see coming. Now, 10 years later, I sat at Sophia's wedding on April 4th, 2025, the Rosewood's marble cold beneath my heels, my velvet gown whispering against the chair. My father raised a champagne glass, his voice booming with the authority he'd wielded like a weapon. "To our only daughter, Sophia," he said, the words a dagger aimed at my chest. I didn't flinch. I'd spent a decade building Vanguard, acquiring Carter assets piece by piece, warehouses they'd let rot, routes they'd abandoned, contracts they'd dismissed as unworthy. I'd mapped their empire like a grandmaster plotting a checkmate, learning every weakness, every crack. And tonight, I watched them toast their only daughter, 30 feet from the one they'd erased, the one who'd paid for the ice sculpture of a Carter ship melting slowly in the corner. Sophia took the mic, her white gown shimmering like starlight, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. Isabella was my best friend, she said, pausing for effect. My protector. She told me to chase my dreams. I wish she could see me now. I remembered her braiding my hair as kids, her small hands tugging gently, her giggles filling our shared bedroom. I remembered the night I taught her to ride a bike, her squeals of triumph when she finally pedaled alone. Then I remembered her silence after my death, the photos, the black dress, the faint smile as she stood by my empty grave. A brittle, angry heat bloomed in my chest, but I stayed still, a ghost in velvet, my mask hiding the storm behind my eyes. Then it happened, a twist I hadn't planned. The string quartet faded, and a hush fell as the groom's best man, a lanky man in a silver mask, stepped forward with a glass raised. I recognized him instantly. Tommy Callahan, my childhood friend, the boy who'd lived 3 houses down and once dared me to climb the oak tree in our backyard. He'd been at every Carter event growing up, a constant shadow with a crooked grin. To Sophia and Michael, Tommy began, his voice warm. And to the Carters, who've given us so many memories. He paused, his eyes scanning the room, then locking on mine. You know, I'll never forget Isabella Carter. She was the bravest person I knew. And sometimes I swear I still feel her here. The crowd murmured, a ripple of polite nostalgia. But Tommy didn't break eye contact. He tilted his head, squinting through his mask, and my heart slammed against my ribs. He stepped off the dais, weaving through the guests, his glass still in hand, until he stood just feet away from me. Bella, he whispered, loud enough for the nearest tables to turn. Is that you? The room tilted. My mask felt suffocating, my accent slipping as I stammered. You're mistaken, sir. I'm Isabella Moreau. But Tommy's eyes widened, his voice trembling with certainty. No, that scar on your wrist. The bike crash. It's you. I glanced down. My sleeve had ridden up, revealing the faint white line from that summer day when Tommy and I had tumbled into the gravel. My breath hitched, tears pricking my eyes as memories flooded back, his laughter as we raced down the street, the secrets we'd whispered under the stars, the way he'd hugged me when I left for college, promising we'd always be friends. I'd buried that girl, but here she was, exposed by a friend I'd never thought I'd see again. Tommy, please, I whispered, my voice raw, the accent gone. Not here. He froze, confusion warring with recognition, but before he could speak, my mother's voice cut through the silence, slurred and unsteady from champagne. What's this nonsense? She stumbled forward, her monogrammed clutch slipping from her fingers. To all of you who stood by us after we lost Isabella, even when she didn't deserve it. Margaret, my father hissed, grabbing her arm, his face tight with panic. She thought she was better than us. She laughed, the sound jagged and raw, peeling back years of cold composure. As if a Carter could survive alone. The room froze. Tommy stared at me, realization dawning, his glass slipping from his hand to shatter on the marble. And then, my voice broke free, unbidden. She's not alone anymore. My mother turned, squinting through the haze, recognition fighting disbelief. Who? She whispered, leaning forward, her glass trembling. My father jumped in, his voice smooth but strained. My wife's had too much excitement, he said to the crowd, forcing a laugh. The memories, you understand. Too late. Tommy's words, my mother's outburst. They'd cracked the Carter facade wide open, and I stood at the center, a ghost unmasked, tears burning behind my eyes. The night after the wedding, I sat alone in the Rosewood's crystal ballroom, The chandeliers dimmed, the chairs stacked, the echoes of the masquerade replaced by a hollow silence. My velvet gown lay crumpled on a table. I'd traded it for a simple black sweater and jeans, the gold compass still at my throat, a cold weight against my skin. Tomorrow, I'd walk into Carter's Shipping and claim it all, the boardroom, the legacy, the truth. But tonight, I wasn't sure I could. My phone buzzed on the marble floor beside me, Jasmine's name lighting up the screen. I opened the email, my stomach tightening as I read. Boss, they're preparing to file bankruptcy. Charles got wind of the rumors after the wedding. Tommy's outburst tipped them off. They're liquidating what's left to block us. If we don't move now, Vanguard could lose everything: Singapore, Jakarta, the Rosewood. We're over-leveraged. And there's something else. A familiar name just bought 5% of their supplier network through a Cayman Island firm. It's Nathaniel Blake. I stared at the words, my hands trembling. Nathaniel Blake. The name hit like a punch, dragging up the memory of his smug grin, his hand on my arm, his voice promising I'd be his. 10 years ago, I'd walked away from him, and now he was back, a shadow creeping into my game. 5% of Carter's suppliers wasn't much, but it was a foothold, a whisper of something bigger. Had he been watching me all this time? My empire. Every warehouse, every route, every contract I'd clawed from their scraps was teetering on the edge of collapse. I'd built Vanguard to bury them, to prove I was more than the daughter they'd erased. But what if I'd miscalculated? What if Nathaniel was the real predator here, waiting for me to overplay my hand? The room spun. I slid to the floor, my back against a pillar, the marble icy through my sweater. Memories clawed their way up. My father's fist on the desk, my mother's cold dismissal, Sophia's silence as they lowered that empty casket. I'd fought so hard to escape that grave, but here I was, drowning in it again. What was the point? Revenge wouldn't bring back the sister who'd braided my hair, the friend who'd dared me to climb trees, the family I'd once believed in. Maybe they were right. I was nothing without them. And now, with Nathaniel circling, maybe I'd lose it all anyway. Tears welled up, a rare crack in the armor I'd worn for a decade. One slid down my cheek, then another, hot against the cold floor. I pressed my hands to my face, muffling a sob, the compass digging into my chest. Grandma Eleanor's voice echoed in my mind. You're enough, Bella. Always were. But it felt like a light night. I could walk away, let Carter's Shipping burn itself out, let Vanguard fade. I could disappear again, start over somewhere they'd never find me. But then I saw it. The ice sculpture from the wedding, half melted in a corner, a Carter ship sinking into a puddle. They'd built that legacy on pride, not strength, and I'd rebuilt it with every step they'd dismissed. Nathaniel might be moving, but I'd faced worse odds with less. I wasn't nothing. I was the one who'd turned their scraps into gold, who'd bought their precious rosewood, who'd outplayed them at their own game. I wiped my eyes, my breath steadying. The tears stopped, replaced by a fire I hadn't felt since that motel room 10 years ago. I grabbed my phone, typed a reply to Jasmine. Let's begin. And dig into Blake's move. Everything you can find. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that boardroom, not as a ghost, but as a queen. They'd buried me once. They wouldn't get a second chance. And Nathaniel? I'd deal with him next. The next morning, Boston woke to chaos. Tommy's whispered Bella, and my mother's drunken rant had spread like wildfire, reaching the financial district by sunrise. I stepped into Carter Shipping's headquarters at 8 a.m., the lobby humming with tension, receptionists whispering behind their desks, executives walking faster than usual, eyes avoiding mine. I wore crimson, a power suit the color of blood, sharp heels clicking like a war drum, my grandmother's gold compass glinting at my throat. The woman at the front desk stood as I approached, her smile nervous. I'm sorry, Miss Moreau. The board meeting today is private. Not anymore, I said, sliding a thick envelope across the counter. Proof of Vanguard's majority stake in their debt and assets, every warehouse, every ship, every loan they'd defaulted on. My fifth win. Her eyes widened as she scanned the documents, her hand trembling as she buzzed me through. 14th floor, boardroom. In my earpiece, Jasmine's voice came through, calm and steady. All 12 board members are present. Charles is pushing a restructuring plan to save the company. He doesn't know Vanguard holds the majority of their secured debt. Perfect, I said, stepping into the elevator. Time to take off the mask. The doors dinged open, and I exhaled once, steadying myself. The boardroom doors were tall, carved oak, familiar. 10 years ago, I'd stood just outside them, a fresh-faced graduate begging to present my modernization plan, only to be told my duty was to marry Nathaniel Blake and let the men handle strategy. Now, I didn't knock. I pushed them open and walked in. 12 men in suits turned to face me, their murmurs dying mid-sentence. My father stood at the head of the table, frozen, a marker poised over a whiteboard scribbled with desperate numbers. Miss Moreau, he managed, his voice tight. This is a closed meeting. Not anymore. I walked to the center of the room and placed a folder on the table, 10 years of receipts, deeds, contracts, evidence of ownership. Their warehouses, their shipping routes, their homes. I represent Vanguard Logistics. We now hold controlling interest in your assets. Starting today, we're initiating a full merger. My father flipped through the documents, his hands shaking, his face paling as the truth landed like a sledgehammer. This can't be, he whispered. These properties are home, the hotel chain. All mine, I said evenly. Just like the clients you lost. Just like the ports you forgot to update while chasing old money deals. This is hostile, he snapped, slamming the folder shut. It's a betrayal. No, Charles, I said, stepping closer, my voice low and cutting. Betrayal was faking my death. Betrayal was burying me instead of letting me lead. One of the board members, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, squinted at me. Wait, I've seen you before. Of course you have, I said, taking off my glasses, letting my natural accent slip through, Boston-born, unpolished by tutors. My name is Isabella Moreau. But once, I was Isabella Carter, the daughter this company declared dead. Gasps rippled through the room. My father stumbled backward, clutching the table like it could anchor him. No, he breathed. You're dead.
Dead,
I said, stepping forward, my heels echoing in the silence. Hardly. But your company? That's another story. By noon, the press conference was standing room only. Cameras lined the walls of Carter Shipping's lobby, reporters packed every inch, employees leaning over balconies, whispering, snapping photos with their phones. They all wanted to know the same thing. Who was Isabella Moreau, and why did she now control one of Boston's oldest empires? I waited 10 minutes before stepping onto the stage, just long enough to remind them who held the power now. I wore navy blue today. Carter blue, a subtle message that the legacy wasn't ending, just changing hands. The gold compass at my throat gleamed in the lights, a quiet tribute to the grandmother who'd believed in me. Thank you all for coming, I began, my voice steady, echoing through the marble halls my family once ruled without question. My name is Isabella Moreau, but some of you may remember me by another name. I paused, then looked directly into the cameras, letting the mask fall completely. Isabella Carter. The room exploded. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed like lightning, a cacophony of chaos I'd orchestrated. From the side, I heard my mother gasp, half hidden behind a pillar, her posture rigid with shock. I held up my hand for silence, and slowly, they obeyed. 10 years ago, the Carter family announced my tragic death in a sailing accident. I said, my tone calm but unyielding. But the truth is far less convenient. I didn't die. I refused an arranged marriage to Nathaniel Blake. I challenged the outdated ways this company was being run. And instead of hearing me out, my family chose to bury me, to protect their pride, their image, their control. I scanned the room. My father stood with the board, his face ashen, hands clenched at his sides. My mother's eyes darted, searching for an escape that didn't exist. In the years since I built Vanguard Logistics from the ground up, I continued. We embraced innovation, modern technology, and client-focused solutions. It started with a warehouse in Singapore they'd dumped, a shipping route they'd let die, a contract they'd turned away. Piece by piece, I turned their scraps into an empire. And along the way, we acquired Carter's shipping assets, quietly, legally, and thoroughly. Today, I'm announcing the full merger of Vanguard Logistics and Carter Shipping. The Carter name will remain, but under new leadership. All current board members will be retired, effective immediately. The crowd erupted again, a tidal wave of noise. I spotted Sophia near the back, her honeymoon tan still fresh, her expression a swirl of disbelief and recognition. She pushed through the throng, her white sneakers scuffing the marble, until she stood just below the stage. We locked eyes for a moment, long enough for her to see me, the real me, not the ghost they'd mourned. A reporter shouted, "What happens to the Carter family?" "They'll retain their personal assets," I said coolly, "those not already owned through Vanguard subsidiaries. And they'll receive generous compensation packages. This isn't about revenge." Another pressed, "Then what is this about?" I hesitated, just for a breath, letting the weight settle. "It's about truth," I said. "About reclaiming what was stolen. About proving that a daughter who chooses independence over obedience isn't a failure, but a leader." I stepped down from the podium as the room burst into a frenzy, my security team shielding me from the chaos. Sophia caught my arm, her grip tight, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I miss you, Bella," she said, her voice breaking. I didn't understand what they did. I studied her trembling lip, the faint scar on her cheek from when we'd crashed our bikes as kids. "Maybe you didn't," I said, my tone steady but edged with a quiet steel. "But when they buried me, you smiled for the camera." I paused, letting the weight of it sink in. "If you ever want to meet the woman I became, come find her. But don't expect to find the sister you left behind." She froze, her breath catching, tears spilling over as the truth landed. Not a rejection, but a challenge. I pulled my arm free and turned away, her sob echoing behind me as a courier slipped through the crowd and pressed an envelope into my hand. I tore it open, my pulse quickening. Inside, a handwritten note in sharp, deliberate script. "I know who you are, Isabella. And I'm coming for what's mine. Nathaniel Blake." My breath caught. The man I'd rejected, the one who'd lost his merger, his pride, when I walked away, was back. And the postmark was Boston, dated yesterday. I stepped into the cool April air outside, security flanking me, the note burning in my pocket. Nathaniel's return wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. I'd assumed he'd faded into obscurity after I refused him, a broken man licking his wounds in some country estate. But this wasn't the scrawl of a defeated drunk. It was precise, calculated, and it confirmed what Jasmine had hinted at last night. Her voice crackled in my earpiece as I climbed into my car. "Boss," I dug deeper. "That 5% stake in Carter Suppliers? It was a decoy. Blake's been moving for weeks. He just bought a 15% stake in Vanguard through a proxy 2 days ago. Shell company's offshore accounts, he's been tracking you. He's got resources, and he's not stopping." My stomach dropped. My 6th win, the public triumph, the reclaiming of my name, suddenly felt fragile, a house of cards in a rising wind. Nathaniel wasn't just a ghost from my past. He was a predator, and he'd waited a decade to strike, biding his time while I built the empire he now wanted to claim. That 5% was his opening move. This 15% was his check. I glanced back at the building. Sophia stood in the doorway, watching me, her face streaked with tears, torn between the sister she'd lost and the family she'd chosen. My parents huddled nearby, powerless for the first time in their lives, their empire slipping through their fingers like sand. And somewhere out there, Nathaniel was moving, a shadow I'd underestimated. The company was mine. The legacy redefined. But the truth? That was a battlefield, and the war had just begun. The cameras flashed as my car pulled away, the city blurring past my window, my mind racing with what came next. Nathaniel's move changes everything, but that's a fight for another day. If you want to see how this empire stands or falls, how a ghost faces a shadow, hit that subscribe button below. I'm Isabella Moreau, and I'm just getting started.